Hello and welcome to Dateline London. I'm Sean Lay. President Donald Trump is celebrating his first legislative triumph after the US Senate passed tax cuts in the early hours of Saturday morning. Should he be looking over his shoulder now? His former national security advisor has admitted lying to the FBI about contacts with Russia. We'll also discuss why Ireland's border could be a Brexit barrier come Monday. With me in the studio, the Irish writer and broadcaster Brian O'Connell, the Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani, Geoffrey Kaufman, who spent many years working for the US networks, and the UK political commentator Steve Richards. Welcome to you all. Thanks for being with us again. Robert Mueller, the special prosecutor in the United States who's dealing with President Trump's situation, has gained an interesting scalp today, that of the former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Mr. Mueller is, of course, examining links between the administration and Russia. Mr. Flynn has admitted that he lied to the vice president about his contacts with Russia. That was why he was fired in the first place. But he's now admitted he lied to the FBI too. The question is whether his admission of could be part of a plea deal with Robert Mueller that could take the investigation into the White House. Geoffrey, does this now smack of a plea bargain?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can record December 1st, 2017 as both the best and the worst day of Trump's presidency so far. He got this massive tax cut passed by the Senate just by a hair, and yet now the pressure is the noose is tightening around the White House, and if not him, certainly those close. What we see from Flynn is that he has in this agreement, he is pointing fingers at senior White House officials. And the U.S. media is rife with speculation that that is Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law. So Trump's hope, and he has stated this publicly many times in quoting his own counsel, is that this will be over by Christmas, all cleaned up, I can move on. That's not the case. And this is a case of Trump's alternate reality catching up with him.
And in terms of the practicalities of this, Steve, how big a distraction is it for him?
I think it's going to be a running background theme throughout his entire presidency, however long it lasts. I don't think it will overwhelm him because he's not the type of figure to be overwhelmed by a single issue. He will move on to other factors. In fact, in some ways, although I know exactly what you mean about the tax cut being the best day because he's got some legislation through, I think the implications of that will be just as serious as Russia because it's part of an entirely incoherent approach to the role of government. He promised to be the most active statist in the history of US politics, spending like no other, albeit more on capital spending than current spending. He's introduced a tax cut which he will argue will produce funds because it will generate growth. When that doesn't happen, his whole pitch to the so-called left behind, I think, will be found to be exposed and wholly incoherent. And the tax cut is part of that. The Russia story, I think, as you imply, hasn't quite got him yet. By implication it has, but not directly. And while that remains the case, it will be a background story rather than the one that brings him down.
And this is not an argument that we will look to many of his supporters like what they expect, the establishment doing their bit to try and bring him down. And therefore, in a sense, it's almost factored out.
You know, though the Trump presidency is really a test of the resilience of American institutions and American democracy in a way that certainly in our lifetime we've never seen. You know, can the courts remain independent? Can his meddling be held to account? And what we're seeing is that so far, yes, and his attempts to knock Mueller over were unsuccessful, and now it's coming back at him. But you know, on the tax cuts. It's so interesting sitting in the UK talking about this because we talk about, well, Brexit is a generational change. This will affect your grandchildren. And Trump is going to be gone in 4 or maybe 8 years. This tax cut is a generational tax cut. Yeah. And this is going to affect America, whether he's gone in a year at the end of his first term or survives 2 terms. This is a pivot for American culture, the American economy. He claims it's middle class. Every independent analysis suggests that this is a massive gain for the wealthy, the middle class and the working class.
They still get a tax cut, but they don't get it's not as the same sort of proportion on the same scale.
In time, though, it diminishes,
right.
and whereas
and
the
it's got
business ones grow.
sunset clauses, so eventually it would disappear.
Absolutely.
Right, okay. And in terms, Nabila, of what that means, he is now at least delivering. He has concrete evidence that he's done something. Isn't that going to be more important to a lot of voters than whether or not there's an investigation ongoing?
No, I think that the latest controversy, I mean, I'd like to think that the latest controversy will really be the beginning of the end for Trump. But there has been so many low points in his wretched presidency that it's really difficult to gauge the significance of it all. But I think that, as we know, official inquiries can take a very long time. And it's actually Trump's erratic behavior and increasingly demonic behavior that got him through a campaign that he didn't look likely to win in the first place. And I'm on the opinion that societies actually deserve the politicians they get. And Trump personifies, a great nation in crisis. And for this reason, he'll be fighting tooth and nail against his opponents, and he's in an immensely powerful position to do so. And meanwhile, he's already announcing next week that he's going to move the American embassy to Jerusalem. So this is an utterly provocative move, and so typical of disgraceful leaders who try to create red herring and try to make out that all problems are in foreign policy. Meanwhile, it's a massive distraction from the huge problems at home. He's dealing with a hugely divided, unequal nation at the moment, and Americans have only themselves to blame for putting him in that position and indeed sustaining this state of affairs.
Do you think they have to accept that, Jeffrey? I know you're not American, you're Canadian by birth, but you know the United States very well.
Do they have to accept that? I think it's true. We have a deeply divided nation, and I was just in the Midwest, and there is a festering sense of resentment and anger. There are so many people struggling with 2 jobs to stay just above water. They're not saving anything, and they feel that the world is passing them by.
And he spoke to that. Donald Trump spoke to that during the campaign.
And the problem is the solutions he offered are not realistic. Has he talked about bringing coal back? I mean, it's just not realistic. We're about to see another wave of technology put truck drivers and taxi drivers out of work, with automation. There is a real sense of fear, and he speaks to that. So, I think his constituency, that core is there.
Brian, is he distracted now, do you think, by the Russia investigation? Can he avoid being distracted by it if it gets this closer and closer?
Yeah, he will just move the agenda onto something else. I mean, he gets up and goes on Twitter every morning and does this. And he has the rest of the world talking about some obscure right-wing group that
of course we had it this week,
never even heard of anyway.
With the retweets of these videos.
The BBC actually maybe has to look at how much coverage they give, that sort of thing as well. But he is the president, so presumably it would have to go to impeachment. Impeachment is a political process.
It's not going to happen.
And it's probably not going to happen. No. And Mueller how long will that go on for? 3-4 years, his first term anyway. And he has, as you say, he has 1 notch on his legislative belt so far. And he's probably happy with that, I would have thought.
Could he have more, Steve? Is there the potential there now that the Senate has managed to pass tax cuts? I know this bill will have to be merged with whatever the House of Representatives come up with, but there's a sense that actually this is now a concrete achievement. Is that the catalyst for other things to be achieved after a year that in legislative terms has been pretty rotten for him?
It depends
although
what
he's not the only president to encounter that.
No, exactly. I mean, that's a common challenge for most presidents. But it depends what you mean by other things. The tax cuts is something that brings together quite a large part of the Republican Party, not least in Washington, which has been a kind of Reaganite, Thatcherite party beyond the era of Reagan and Thatcher. They, of course, famously imposed spending cuts on Obama when he wanted to pass a more high spending budget. And so in this area, he brings together the Republican Party. In most other areas, he doesn't. So no, I don't think this is going to be the beginning of a legislative program of substantial reform in which the Republican Party unites around him. It's too disparate and contradictory and shallow and incoherent for that to happen, I think.
But what's happening sort of just below the radar is equally significant. We're seeing a real push to put young, very conservative judges in state and lower level courts, and we're seeing a purging of the State Department, a huge exodus of career diplomats at what some are calling a crisis level.
And for example, there isn't even an US ambassador in South Korea at the moment.
Absolutely.
Even though North Korea is such a critical
absolutely,
issue.
And career diplomats are being pushed out, and so while it's true the legislative agenda it may or may not move forward, and that he has this significant triumph, he still has to sign it. It still has to be reconciled with the House.
Yes.
But there is this cultural shift happening
cultural
in the
change.
institutions.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And do Republicans think that they could run on these tax cuts in November of next year, a year from now when we have the midterm elections, which are so important in shaping the run-up to the next presidential?
They desperately needed this, absolutely, because what they're really running on, I think, is fear. Because what you see is if you stand up like Senator Corker did,
Corker, who's the
Senator
Republican
Flake,
objected to these
the two who've objected, they're not running again, because if you stand up in this culture of polarized politics, you will be massacred on social media and by the conservative right, and so dissent is simply not an option. You either follow, keep quiet, or leave.
Now, Ireland was partitioned in 1922, but almost immediately the newly created republic in the UK, of which Northern Ireland remained part, agreed their citizens could move freely back and forth across the border. During the 30 years of violence which bedeviled the north, there were armed soldiers, vehicle checks and razor wire. These days, after 2 decades of peace, about the only physical sign you're changing countries are road signs shifting between miles and kilometres. Brexit could change that. By Monday, the UK has to present to EU negotiators in Brussels ideas for avoiding the return of border posts and checks, what's known as a hard border, or the divorce negotiations can't move on to post-Brexit trade. Brian, in terms of what is possible and what can be achieved, why have we got to this stage where we are so close to a deadline and nobody really seems to be clear about what these solutions are to the border problem?
Because, and this is not an Irish government view, because the Irish government is one of 27 EU countries. The reason we're at this stage now is because the British didn't listen at the beginning. If you go back to a month after the referendum campaign, I think it was the 28th of July 2016, Enda Kenny, who was the then Taoiseach, turns up in Downing Street. Theresa May's just first meeting between...
Because she hasn't been Prime
Kenny
Minister for very long. Yep.
And first meeting with the new Prime Minister, they have lunch, and they agree that all the nice stuff about frictionless borders and things have to continue as they are. Now, the Irish then went off and they went round all the other 26 EU capitals, and they said this is a crucial issue. And they explained why. And the British went off and looked at other stuff to do with Brexit and said, well, that's the Irish sorted out. And of course, when it came to setting up the Barnier talks, there's Ireland as one of the 3 things. That's because the Irish went around the other 26 capitals and said, we want, this is going to be really important.
So they did their homework.
But they did their homework, and the British kind of parked it. Now, there's all kinds of reasons for that, which we can come back to, but in terms of what's achievable, my understanding is they haven't got a deal yet. The deadline is, I think, lunchtime on Monday, when Mrs. May goes to meet Jean-Claude Juncker for lunch.
Always her favourite lunching partner.
Absolutely,
yes,
absolutely.
What a lot of people in the UK probably don't grasp, and you might be able to help with this, is why is it possible for a border to operate, for example, between Norway, which is not a member of the European Union, and Sweden relatively painlessly, or indeed between Switzerland, which is not a member of the European Union, and France relatively painlessly? And then, but everyone says it's going to be a potential crisis between Northern Ireland and the Republic, one outside the EU, one in.
Because the countries you mention have various arrangements with the single market or the EEA or whatever it happens to be, for which they pay, they sign deals. And the problem with the Northern Ireland border and the British and Irish positions is that both sides agree that this should be a frictionless, open, happy-go-lucky border, but the British are saying we don't want to be in the single market or the customs union, and we also don't want as was suggested by the Irish at one point, a dividing line down the Irish Sea, so the border would be there. So you can't actually work that Rubik's Cube out. It's never going to happen. So what you've got to do is, I think the best. I think William Hague,
former British Foreign Secretary,
was positing this is you go back and you look at the Good Friday Agreement and you go through it in detail and you pull out all the little bits and take a lot. That's what European Commissions are for, anyway. and they've done this and they've gone through it. And I think there's 142 issues that
within the Good Friday Agreement.
Because the Good Friday Agreement was based on the premise that both sides were going to be within the European Union. So it goes down to things like, obviously, animal welfare crossing the border, but things like ambulances crossing the border. So if you have a heart attack on the south and the nearest hospital is just across the border on the north, all that kind of stuff. And you deal with them one by one, and you have a sort of regulatory convergence. Now, this is where the DUP start jumping up and down and saying, oh, no, we're not going to do that.
Steve, this is very interesting. I was in Newry in Northern Ireland on Friday night, which is probably, I think, fair to say is a broadly nationalist part of Northern Ireland. But nonetheless, the border issue was an important issue for politicians there. But the DUP deputy leader, who's in charge of their MPs at Westminster, the man who negotiated the deal with Theresa May to keep her in office, said there is no special status. There will not be a special status for Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland will be treated exactly the same as any part of the UK. And Theresa May said that, and I believe she's a woman of her word. How on earth are they going to reconcile this?
I don't know. And it is very interesting if you look back at the referendum in the United Kingdom on this. Northern Ireland came up once when John Major and Tony Blair went to speak there. Now, the reason and that was it. It generated no response, not much interest, and that was the sole focus. Now, they are a reminder of two prime ministers who lived and breathed Northern Ireland politics and the Good Friday Agreement, and they would have known about the significance and the multi-layered complexities.
And the Good Friday Agreement is this peace agreement that effectively, not completely, but brought an end to the armed violence that was taking place for decades.
And as Brian would say, on the assumption of Northern Ireland being part of the European Union, like Southern Ireland. And suddenly all this changes. And Theresa May arrives. She was Home Secretary. She obviously had security issues with Northern Ireland. But beyond that, Northern Ireland had not been on her radar as a senior politician. And I think she hugely underestimated it. In fairness to David Davis and others, they are now... the British Brexit Secretary in the United Kingdom. They are now acutely aware of it. And they do have a logical point in saying, before we know the end agreement, it's very hard to deal with the Northern Ireland situation because until we know the degree to which free trade is going to apply more widely, you can't deal with this. But there, as you know better than anyone, there is a huge pressure to get some sort of sense of what will happen by the December summit.
The Irish government are not suggesting that we have to have everything glued to the floor before we move on to the next thing. What they're saying is, You've given us all the sort of airy-fairy, yes, we all agree that the border has to be... the reassurances. And in fact, there was a British paper produced last August, I think, where they talked about trusted traders and technology and all kinds of stuff, which the EU Commission described as magical thinking. And that was all the British government have provided so far. So the Irish now, what Leo Varadkar is saying now is give us something that we can hang on to and in writing that is a guarantee that you will not...
More concrete.
Yes, more. It has to be concrete and credible, I think, are the two words they're using. And it doesn't have to actually answer every single question, but it does have to give us some sort of idea of how this open border is going to work.
Nabila, given how much hangs on this, surely common sense says they will find a way around this. They're not going to allow this whole process to be wrecked because they can't quite agree a form of words that gets them onto the next stage. Well,
I'm afraid with so many issues around Brexit, it effectively boils down to getting square pegs into round holes. And, you know, Ireland's relationship with Britain has always been loaded with emotive issues, not least of all religion and nationalism. But the massive stumbling block here is a technical one. And if Britain wants a proper Brexit, then of course it has to have a border, a hard border with its closest EU state. Otherwise, all the bêtes noires that underpin Brexit, especially immigrants and non-British goods, will just keep, flowing, will be able to move into the UK, with no hindrance. And the whole point of Brexit is to stop all that, the flow of people, goods, and indeed animals, and have a border between southern and northern. And if there's no physical border between southern and northern Ireland, then it's very difficult to achieve that.
Jeffrey, at the time of the attempt to achieve the peace agreement that became the Good Friday Agreement, as it became known, British politicians, British prime ministers could always pick up the phone and ring somebody in Washington, and there was always a sense that America's interest in the fate of Ireland and what was happening in Northern Ireland was considerable, that there were always politicians, Republican or Democrat, who cared and were passionate about it. Is there still that
No,
interest?
of course not. I think any semblance of it. We remember that early hand-holding at the White House with Theresa May and Donald Trump. I don't think they'll be grabbing one another's hands after this week when Trump retweeted those odious videos, anti-Muslim videos that were, at least one of which was totally fictitious, and Theresa May, to her credit, slapped him down, and he then slapped her down, and so it goes.
He
so
said, mind your business in Britain. We're fine.
Absolutely.
Here.
Let me throw another cliche at you, and so he did. I think that she's very much can't rely, and she had hoped, of course, that some quick trade deal with the U.S. would somehow paper over the massive potential loss of trade with Europe, but no, she can't. And I must say she clearly, her kind of glib, that Brexit means Brexit. Now that she's caught in the devil in the
To be fair,
details.
they don't use that phrase.
No,
anymore,
of course
do
they don't, because they don't know what it means.
Yeah.
It's very clear, and Ireland is an example. I mean, that kind of glibness is coming back to bite them. There is so much really difficult detail work here, and Ireland. Who would have thought that Ireland would be the one issue that could potentially trip them up?
I mean, it does go back to the Good Friday Agreement. But if most of us around here remember 20 years ago when they put the Good Friday Agreement together, they had this thing called constructive ambiguity. So we said, well, we'll figure out afterwards, decommission. Yeah, well, we'll get around to that. Now, you can't do that with this, because up until now, with all those sensitive issues, because you need to actually explain to people how their livelihoods are going to be able to continue if they run a dairy farm on just a mile north of the border, and the milk is pasteurized or turned into cheese or whatever it is on the south of the border. Because the integration between, and it's not just agriculture, it's loads of things, along that border area is enormous. There's a former senior guy in Diageo who always says...
The drinks maker,
he always says the milk that goes into the bottle of Bailey's comes from Northern Ireland, and it crosses the border 5 times for pasteurization and this and that and the other before it ends up in the bottle. It goes over and back 5 times. But you have that kind of a very, very integrated economy on both sides of the border, and creative ambiguity is not going to, constructive ambiguity is not going to work.
I think that reintroducing a border can actually revive the division that defined the Troubles and can in fact undo all the good progress made by the Good Friday Agreement. But I think all this is about, technical puzzles, ones that highlight the horrendous difficulty that underpinned the Brexit process, after following a very simple decision made by Britain to leave the EU. So it's all about nuts and
the election
bolts.
is coming back to haunt them, because the DUP, the Nationalist
This is the
Party,
general election this year that left the Tories without a majority.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're now reliant on this rump party in Northern Ireland of nationalists to support them to maintain their government here at Westminster, and now Theresa May really is at their mercy, and so that gives her much less room to navigate.
It is interesting, isn't it, that it's such an emblematic example of the complexity of this, that on this, both sides agree on the end. The EU and the UK want a soft border, and yet they can't quite work out how. So even where there is agreement on an end, it's not at all clear how they reach it. Now, on many other issues, there isn't an agreement on the end. And even if she gets through the December summit, this crucial moment in her premiership, because if she doesn't, there will be a sense of crisis around her. So I assume
And
she
you think that
will.
would finish her off?
Well, I think such predictions are dangerous now, but I think there will be a huge sense of crisis if she doesn't get through to the next round of much more mountainously complex talks after December, which is why I think she has got a sense that the Brexit payment will open a door of sorts, assuming something can be done on Ireland. And no, if she doesn't, there will be a huge... She can't come back from another summit and deliver a statement to the House of Commons saying we've made no
It's also
progress.
going to require a lot of flexibility by the EU as well, because if they do have these sort of measures where, you know, regulatory convergence, the EU is going to have to say, well, okay, it's not the way we run the single market normally, but in this case we're going to have to make an exception. I think they're going to have to be fairly flexible on that.
I was intrigued about one of your drinks that you were referring to. I understand that a certain Irish stout may also involve travelling across the border and then back again.
Yes.
Too early in the day to have one of those. Thank you all very much for being with us on Dateline this week. Please do join us again at the same time next week. From all of us on the programme, goodbye.